the person who endowed this lecture series, was born in New York City in 1901, was educated at Yale, class of 1921, and Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and got his medical degree in 1925. Like his father, he became a prominent cardiologist. He served as president of the American College of Cardiologists and the New York Cardiological Society, and was the founding member and president of the American College of Sports Medicine. He's the author and co-author of lots of scientific articles and 2 memoirs, The Birth of a Specialty, The Diary of an American Cardiologist, 1926 to 1972, and Myself When Young, Growing Up in New York, 1901 to 1925. So you can see he covered his whole life practically with his memoirs. What's less known about Dr. Bishop was his great love of manuscripts, archives, books, and reading. He served for decades as the librarian of the New York Racquet Club, and we met him at a meeting there for the first time. And he wanted to leave a legacy in memory of his recently deceased son by endowing a lecture series that would perpetuate that love. He donated his personal papers to Rutgers and his scientific papers to Columbia University Health Sciences Library. We were grateful that he lived to see the very first lecture in the spring of 1986. He attended that lecture and then unfortunately died very shortly thereafter at his home in Manhattan. You could see through the handout here, I'm not going to go through any specifics, but through the handout and I think through the slideshow that we showed as you were coming in, just how diverse these lectures have been. Everything from very highbrow to politics to the mysticism and the occult, and many, many other great topics. And today's is a very, very appropriate one, celebrating our 250th anniversary. So please take that home and you can see a little bit about what we've been doing over the years. And we hope to be doing this for many, many more years. So without further ado, I think we'll continue the program. And again, I'm looking forward to talking to you all right after.
Thank you, Ron. It is most appropriate to have one of Rutgers' own historians of American education to introduce our Bishop lecturer. I met Ben Justice many years ago when he agreed to serve as a consultant for a social studies curriculum development project that we launched in 1997. I recently had the privilege of working with him as a co-author of the History and Politics section of the Rutgers 250th Anniversary Portrait. A product of Yale and Stanford, Ben is currently the chair of the Department of Educational Theory, Policy, and Administration in the Graduate School of Education here at Rutgers. Among his many publications, his book, The Founding Fathers' Education in the Great Contest, the American Philosophical Society Essay Prize of 1797, won the 2014 Critics' Choice Book Award of the American Educational Studies Association. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Benjamin Justice to the Bishop Lecture and thank him for introducing our speaker.
Thanks, Tom. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Roger Geiger. Dr. Geiger currently serves as Distinguished Professor of Education and Senior Scientist at Pennsylvania State University. He is the author of numerous books and almost innumerable articles on the history of American higher education. Since 1993, he has been the editor of the History of Higher Education Annual, which has been retitled Perspectives on the History of Higher Education. His most recent book, The History of American Higher Education, Learning and Culture from the Founding to World War II, is likely to be the new standard text in the field and establishes him as the Dean of History of American Higher Education. Sorry to put the responsibilities of deanhood on you. I immediately take it back. Now, all of this you can read on his CV, so let me tell you something that you might not know about Professor Geiger. When he graduated with his PhD in 1972 from the University of Michigan, he was part of the then largest cohort of history PhDs in history. And this was at precisely the same time that higher education ceased its long period of expansion and hiring. This led him to a postdoc, naturally, at Yale University, followed by over a decade of living on soft money as a researcher in higher education from 1974 to 1987. In '87, Dr. Geiger joined the faculty at Penn State and began a more traditional academic career. Now, you can't ask a historian to just present information without some interpretation. So if I may be permitted, I'm going to offer a little bit of interpretation. I think that this non-traditional path to becoming a history professor made him a better one. The breadth of his work before going to Penn State is impressive and surprising given his more recent scholarship. For example, his dissertation traced the development of sociology as a discipline in France, from positivism to the Durkheimians. This was intellectual history, but not traditionally so, examining the ways that ideas intersected with institutions, situating both within larger social contexts. While at Yale, he focused on comparative study of higher education, work which culminated in his 1986 book, Private Sectors in Higher Education, Structure, Function, and Change in, get this, 8 countries. Thus, by the time he got to Penn State, he had chops in sociology, intellectual history, comparative history, and higher educational policy. But he also, importantly, had never been insulated from the economics of higher education, as so many of us who have gone right into the tenure stream have, and largely positive force in American life, often despite itself. Please join me in welcoming Professor Geiger.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Tom. And it's indeed an honor to be invited to deliver the 30th Bishop Lecture. And I'm so happy that that you needed an historian of higher education to complement the 250th celebration, and hence I'm quite honored to be here. And what I want to talk about today is the post-war challenges of Rutgers and Penn State in trying to form themselves into research universities. And I will try not to be romantic or indulgent in doing this. Now, Penn State and Rutgers are usually thought of as rivals, and not always friendly ones. This belief largely reflects athletics, especially now that Rutgers has joined the Big Ten. In fact, the two universities have much in common over their respective histories. Both were among the earliest institutions designated by their states as beneficiaries of the Morrill Land Grant Act, and today both are separated by less than 1 point in the Shanghai Jiaotong rankings of world universities, in places 60 and 64, in case you wondered. The intervening years also saw some significant links. George W. Atherton, Rutgers professor of politics and staunch defender of the land grant movement, was named president of Penn State in 1882, and he is rightly regarded as the second founder of the university. In 1921, Penn State appointed John Thomas as president, who was dedicated to making the college into a true university. He was unfortunately blocked completely by the Pennsylvania governor, and in frustration, he welcomed the opportunity to become president of Rutgers. Having been designated a state university as the State University of New Jersey in 1917, Rutgers appeared to be accomplishing what Penn State could not. But Thomas's efforts in New Brunswick were undermined by his own board of trustees, who wished to keep the institution free from any public control. And in 1929, the title of the State University of New Jersey was rescinded, and no constructive relationship with the state could be devised. Thomas resigned the next year to join an insurance company, where presumably he would not be frustrated by dreams of universities or nightmares of state governments. So my subject today is the frustrations and accomplishments that attended the development of these two institutions in the 2 decades after World War II. These were crucial years. During these years, both institutions managed a transformation into what we today regard as a research university. Viewing them together allows these challenges to be seen in a larger perspective. I'm not an historian of either institution, and rather I hope to view their histories in a national context of issues facing American higher education and particularly public universities during these two eventful decades. And what were those issues? We might make a dichotomy between the relationships with their respective states and state governments on one side, and on the other, how they're related to the higher education system. In an era in which states expected and were expected to provide most of the funding for higher education, state relations were obviously crucial. But behind the funding was a larger phenomenon of the role or roles of a state university in the total provision of higher education. Universities were also embedded in national systems of higher education, which sociologists call organizational fields. That is, complex webs of markets and organizations that affect all the things that universities do, and particularly the many resources that are essential for doing them. These include markets for students and faculty, professional associations, and the research economy. Collectively, these and other factors determine what roles a university fulfills and how effectively they are fulfilled. The components of higher education's organizational field changed rapidly and dramatically during the first two post-war decades, so that aspirations tended to far exceed resources. Thus, public universities attempted to optimize their mix of instruction, research, and service within numerous constraints. Specifically, Rutgers and Penn State faced four challenges in the post-war era, which I will address. First, defining their relationship with the state. Second, determining their share and role in the provision of public higher education. Third, upholding the reputation of the flagship college in the market for undergraduate education. And finally, establishing and advancing their position in the federal research economy. Well, the unhappy experiences of John Thomas reflect the fact that neither institution was accepted as the state flagship university, nor did they enjoy the backing of anything like the majority of the state population. Higher education in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania was dominated by the private sector, not as completely as in our neighbors to the northeast, but nothing like the role accorded state universities further to the west. Consequently, in a period of accelerating enrollments in higher education, Rutgers and Penn State had difficulty conveying the argument that their respective states should provide funds for the faculty and facilities needed to provide quality higher education for state citizens. And politically, state politicians had no difficulty ignoring such arguments. Growth was the greatest challenge of this era. Veterans who attended under the GI Bill were particularly drawn to state universities, which then stuffed in as many as was possible with all kinds of ad hoc arrangements. After they graduated, mostly by 1950, enrollments reached a low point, but still above pre-war numbers. After 1951, enrollments began to rise at an accelerating pace. This growth was tilted towards the public sector. If you want a mnemonic for this, the public-private split was 50-50 in 1950. But in that decade, public institutions added 5 students for every 2 additional students in private colleges. Always looming on the horizon were the baby boom cohorts, who would start graduating from high school in the early 1960s. They would require a substantial expansion of places in public colleges and universities under any set of assumptions. Educational planning was not the forte of these state governments, to say the least, but they received a powerful jolt by the Sputnik crisis in 1957. Suddenly, expanding the quality and the quantity of American higher education appeared to be a national imperative. But let's go back to 1945. That year, Rutgers was restored as the state university of New Jersey. In a fleeting aura of post-war idealism, this act sort of papered over the fact that the university was still governed by a private board of trustees. A reckoning soon followed. A proposed bond offering that would have provided funding for desperately needed buildings allowed the university's enemies to mobilize. Private colleges' interests opposed expansion of the state university, and the taxpayer groups attacked public funding for a privately controlled institution. Voters summarily rejected the bond issue of 1948, Taking that bond issue to the public was probably a terrible idea, since it exposed the lack of popular support for the university and the vulnerability created by its private status. It set in motion repeated efforts to deal with this anomalous status. Rutgers in 1950 was a conglomerate public-private institution. It consisted of a women's college, a men's college that included the land-grant colleges of agriculture and engineering, and several other units in New Brunswick, Newark, and soon Camden. Officially an instrumentality of the state, its 58-member board of trustees had a majority of self-perpetuating members, making it privately controlled. Was this an impossible structure? Well, we might recall that Cornell was also a public-private hybrid, and still is, and still was doing quite well. However, Cornell had been dedicated to being a full-fledged university since its founding under President Andrew Dixon White. Its endowed colleges were legally separate from the state-supported land-grant units, and those colleges were supported by a huge endowment, thanks to Ezra Cornell and subsequent donors. The New York State Legislature was even more hostile to public higher education than New Jersey or Pennsylvania, but it provided a reasonable amount of support for its portion of the university. New Jersey supplied just 1/3 of the operating funds for Rutgers, and its grudging increases limited the rest of the budget, which had to come mainly from student tuition, and which was sinking as the veterans departed. The university was badly squeezed, having to endure inadequate facilities and non-competitive salaries for faculty, which were given a C rating by the AAUP. These difficulties began to be addressed in the late 1950s. In 1956, a new board of governors with a majority of public appointees assumed governance of the whole university. The board of trustees, which largely represented Rutgers College and its alumni, was reduced in size and function. The State University of New Jersey was now, in large measure, governed by the state. Then the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 provided a catalyst for a concerted push to improve and upgrade American education, including preparing public higher education for the impending baby boom. Even the New Jersey legislature was not immune. This juncture marked the beginning of a decade and a half of large and growing appropriations for capital projects and operating expenses, and these were supplemented by an increasing flow of federal monies. In the 7 years after Sputnik, the undergraduate and graduate enrollments at New Brunswick doubled, aided no doubt by the fact that New Jersey did not yet have a state system of regional universities and community colleges. Enrollment growth and revenue growth at Rutgers engaged in a frantic race. The state's contribution to operating funds rose to 50%, and the rating of faculty salaries rose to an A. Pennsylvania State College suffered not so much from hostility in the state as from neglect. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has the dubious distinction of never establishing a public college or university. Penn State was founded by agricultural societies. The members of what is now the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education were all founded privately as normal schools. And Pittsburgh and Temple were private universities until they were rescued from bankruptcy by the state in the 1960s. So Penn State was more fortunate than Rutgers in receiving state building funds after the war. It seems that Republican contractors and Democratic state trade unions could agree on the benefits of spending money on erecting buildings. And that's what they did. These construction funds did not need the approval of the legislator or the voters. So one of the very handy political arrangement in Pennsylvania. But also, unlike Rutgers, Penn State was surrounded by rural countryside. It was described by one president as equally inaccessible from all parts of the state. So it could only teach students that it could provide housing for. And so a succession of dormitory complexes were erected from the late 1950s into the 1970s. New dormitories allowed the main campus to add 5,000 students in the 1950s and 10,000 in the 1960s. For 20 years, Ralph Hetzel had presided over the college. A proficient internal manager, he was noted for extreme caution and a myopic focus on state service. For example, he did not believe that the college should seek students or research funds beyond the state borders. His successor in 1950 was Milton Eisenhower, one of the most dynamic and effective figures ever to lead the institution, if only for 6 years. And he was effective in Harrisburg as well. State appropriations for general operations rose from $10 million to $25 million. After his departure, for personal reasons, the institution girded for the coming enrollment explosion and the state fundings that would be needed to accommodate these students. Instead, the state's largesse was curtailed. After Sputnik, the state greatly increased spending for public schools, but not so much for higher education. Appropriations fell far short of requests, and the university had to resort instead to tuition increases. Unfortunately, this became a more or less permanent condition in Pennsylvania, which is why Pennsylvania has the highest state tuition for in-state students. Another fundamental issue that is rarely addressed directly is what share of the state provision of higher education should the state university provide? What portion of the state's students should it aim to educate? Every state has evolved its own answer. The University of Minnesota, for example, long attempted to monopolize all public higher education. The University of Virginia took the opposite approach, remaining rather small and selective. Where this issue it was confronted directly and publicly, as it was in California, negotiating and resolving a solution presented enormous difficulty. Clark Kerr overcame those difficulties in pushing through the California Master Plan in 1960, which imposed a clear vision on the university role. The University of California would educate the top 1/8 of high school graduates while remaining open to transfers, and monopolize the major professions, doctoral education, and research. Elsewhere, however, the role of the flagship state university tended to be shaped by random events and circumstance. After the war, most state universities enlarged their educational role by establishing branch campuses. Michigan responded to overtures from Flint and Dearborn. Indiana moved into Indianapolis. Illinois into Chicago and Springfield. Purdue into Fort Wayne, Minnesota into Duluth. Thus, Rutgers and Penn State were in good company in their post-war expansions. In many cases, state universities moved into the comparative educational vacuums of major cities, that is, localities that were underserved by existing or faltering private institutions. So, in some cases, state universities annexed struggling private colleges, and in other cases, built new campuses from scratch. But why did they do it? Not for prestige. Branch campuses attracted commuters and part-time students, and the faculty tended to be less credentialed than those at the home campus. And branch campuses inevitably required major capital expenditures. In the 1930s, Rutgers judged that such considerations weighed against taking over the private schools in Newark. The actual process reveals how branch campuses emerged. All these universities had established extension divisions before the war. Thus, extension centers were already serving clienteles in numerous locations. Once institutionalized, there were few obvious limits as long as a demand existed. Then came the GI Bill, and universities relied on extension centers to educate large numbers who could not be squeezed into the main campus. Usually some trigger then happened, a local gift or initiative that elevated the center into a branch campus. Such a move had many benefits for the locality: a better institution of higher education, achieved much more quickly, and some trickle-down prestige from the university. But what were the benefits for the university? A strong sense of public mission, particularly in the post-war years, helped, but that there was also a fear for the emergence of rivals if politically potent localities were neglected, and expectations, in some cases borne out, that the state would pay the bills. Rutgers University President Clothier declared after the war that the university had a moral responsibility to accommodate all qualified veterans and high school graduates. And a university task force 10 years later pledged that Rutgers provide educational opportunities for all qualified persons. Of course, qualified can be an elastic concept, but this rhetoric implied a demographic impossibility. Probably other considerations led to Rutgers absorbing the University of Newark in 1946. According to historian Harold Wexler, Rutgers thought the merger would give it more clout with the governor and legislators. It would divert students for whom there was no room in New Brunswick, and prevent the emergence of a potential rival. It also gave Rutgers a law school and a business school, as well as some arts and sciences students. The takeover of another floundering law school 5 years later, creating a new branch campus in Camden, took place under considerable political pressure, historian Richard McCormick tells us. Nonetheless, universities seem to have an inherent urge to expand. In the case of geographical expansion, one cannot help suspecting it was furthered by the hope or belief that such acts demonstrate service to the citizenry and were likely to be rewarded by the legislature. It's not clear that they ever were. Negatively, Rutgers' expansion seemed to compensate for the Board of Education's refusal to expand the mission of New Jersey's 6 teachers' colleges. Penn State also had reasons to react to a seeming vacuum in public higher education, including the same kind of restrictions on state teachers' colleges. Penn State had grown a large system of extension education in the interwar years. After World War II, Extension operated 4 undergraduate centers and 12 technical institutes. Penn State would entertain any credible request for a center as long as the community furnished and maintained the facilities and the centers were self-supporting. So, with the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh regions dominated by private institutions, Penn State had a vast swath of the state to serve through such centers. They absorbed much of the GI overload and then shrank in the early 1950s, but not for long. In 1953, the centers began awarding associate degrees, thus becoming, in effect, junior colleges. In 1959, 14 locations were upgraded to Commonwealth campuses, no longer part of the university extension and no longer required to be self-supporting. The Penn State University was morphing on its own initiative into a state system of higher education. The notion that Pennsylvania should develop a system of community colleges instead of branch campuses was raised as early as 1957, but the Community College Act only passed in 1963. Although it offered state support for establishing these colleges, few communities found the terms attractive, and just 4 were founded by 1966. Nonetheless, the Commonwealth commissioned 2 successive studies to formulate a master plan. This is obviously a pale imitation of California. Both advocated converting some of the Penn State Commonwealth campuses into community colleges. President Eric Walker and the University Board of Trustees were adamantly opposed. Walker repeatedly argued that the campuses were more effective educationally than the typical community college, even those in California. Moreover, Penn State continued to launch additional campuses and to upgrade existing ones. They were able to point to considerable local support in the form of organizations, advocacy, and donations. This controversy raged through the mid-60s. In the end, Pennsylvania had no master plan, and Penn State, referred to by some as the octopus, had 19 Commonwealth campuses enrolling more than 20,000 students. Penn State in the 1960s wholeheartedly embraced the mission of providing public education for the Commonwealth. In 1965, it enrolled 3 of every 8 students in public higher education. With a state government that was incapable of formulating a higher education policy and unwilling to adequately support higher education for its citizens, Penn State took it upon itself to shoulder this burden. However, there were drawbacks. The main campus housed a faculty increasingly oriented toward research and scholarship. But faculty on the campuses, nominally belonging to the same departments, were largely confined to teaching. 2-year courses at the campuses may have been superior as President Walker maintained, but they probably offered the most expensive associate degrees in the country. And the state government, not out of any particular animosity, but rather out of a traditional unwillingness to pay for public higher education, failed to provide the support that these initiatives warranted. But so this scenario sort of raises the question of what the flagship campus, what kind of undergraduate education for whom on the flagship campus. The most distinctive feature of undergraduate education at post-war Rutgers was certainly single-sex colleges. When the New Jersey College of Women was established in 1918, this practice was consistent with private colleges in the East generally. It also seemed evident that the trustees' determination to preserve private control was linked with keeping historically male Rutgers College, much like neighboring Princeton. The College for Women became a coordinate college, like the Barnard College that Mabel Smith Douglas had graduated from, although on a far leaner budget. All this was in keeping with Eastern notions of prestige, separate men's and women's colleges, and a heavy emphasis on the liberal arts. Plus, a prevailing Eastern disdain for coeducational state universities. Thus, the College for Women changed its name to Douglas College in 1955, as if to emphasize its coordinate status and distance itself from the state university. This structure was increasingly anachronistic in post-war higher education. It helps to account for the pattern of expansion already referred to. Selective men's and women's liberal arts colleges in New Brunswick, and all manner of useful courses for New Jersey citizens in Newark, Camden, and through the University College. But it had its costs. The separate colleges in New Brunswick were inefficient and certainly cramped growth. Of course, all universities have separate units called colleges, but only Rutgers accorded these colleges their own separate departmental faculties. And this impeded academic development. In the late 1960s, less than one-half of Douglas faculty had PhDs. The consolidation of academic departments in 1981 by President Blaustein was later described by President McCormick as a giant step towards academic distinction. Being a state university, and a land grant too, made the men's and women's colleges different from their private would-be peers. Students came overwhelmingly from New Jersey high schools, and a significant number were commuters. Douglas, for all its emphasis on the liberal arts, had vocational roots in home economics and education, subjects that were disdained at the Seven Sisters. For Rutgers, the effort to preserve the ostensible prestige of single-sex colleges in a land-grant service-oriented university produced a split personality that endured long after the decades of this talk. Post-war Penn State College faced the opposite challenge. Although the 14th largest institution in the country, it still carried the image of a cow college and was best known for its football team. Its inward-focused president did nothing to dispel this. However, Milton Eisenhower perceived this to be a problem from the outset. Penn State had to change its image in order to establish its character as a major university. One of his first steps was to change the name of to Penn State University. He carefully laid the groundwork by canvassing all interested parties and discovered apparently no one cared. The university lawyer then went to the county courthouse and changed the name on the charter. Eisenhower went further, though, and he renamed the various schools in the university into colleges, including establishing a College of Business Administration. The symbolism was important, but far more important was Eisenhower's effort to build morale among students and faculty, and also to enhance recognition of the university. Of course, being the brother and close advisor of Dwight D. Eisenhower in itself brought prestige and recognition. Eisenhower made a tangible difference after just 6 years. After his 6 years in the presidency, Penn State looked and functioned like a major state university. Through the 50s and 60s, Rutgers and Penn State attracted above-average students, but could not match the more selective private colleges and universities. When classifications were made in the 1960s, both colleges were ranked very competitive, along with 160 other institutions, including other state universities. Both catered to public high school graduates from their respective states. Eisenhower's successor, Eric Walker, complained, "Penn State is still not getting its share of the brightest students." Then, as now, Penn State was seen to be used as a safety school. But in the 1960s, private schools used their scholarship funds for what we now call merit aid, attracting those bright students. When student qualifications plummeted nationally after 1970, so did the SAT scores at Rutgers and Penn State. Rutgers remained technically selective by rejecting many students, since each of its units had its own admissions criteria, whereas Penn State found a place for virtually every applicant on one of its many campuses. By the mid-1980s, taken together, the average student at each university was pretty close to average. How that changed in the following 2 decades is an intriguing question. In the 21st century, both universities have risen to become highly selective. And I believe the growth of research most likely has something to do with this. Large public universities have an inherent disadvantage in what I call the selectivity sweepstakes, but they have done far better in boosting their prestige through research. However, only a handful of land-grant institutions were established as flagship universities, committed to fulfilling that role. They adapted to the academic revolution of the late 19th century and emerged as research universities in the 20th century. Others were named A&Ms, or agricultural colleges, or just colleges like Rutgers and Penn State. In these institutions, research tended to be confined to agriculture, and the basic academic disciplines remained stunted. Penn State was an engineering school in the early 20th century, and Rutgers' focus was on its liberal arts colleges. The litmus test for participation in academic research is the awarding of PhDs. They require both teaching and research at an advanced level. And PhD candidates comprise a very small market with limited demand. In the 1930s, Rutgers graduated just over 100 PhDs, mostly in agriculture and related subjects, including chemistry. Penn State produced less than 200, half of those in chemistry. In these schools, research tended to become institutionalized in applied fields and dedicated research centers. These can serve as seedbeds for expansion into more basic subjects. At Penn State, agricultural research stimulated development of both chemistry and physics. At both schools, such efforts began to bear fruit after 1945. Selman Waksman's great discovery of streptomycin led directly to the creation of the Institute of Microbiology that now bears his name. The Department of Ceramics provided another node for advanced research. Notably, both these efforts were related to and supported by important state industries. Penn State exploited its engineering expertise after the war to break into federally sponsored research. It acquired the Ordnance Research Laboratory, which focused on underwater sound. And in 1955, it began to operate the first certified university nuclear reactor. Specialized undertakings, such as these 4 examples, continued to expand and diversify into adjacent scientific fields, both basic and applied. The difficulty for latecomers like Rutgers and Penn State was developing departments in basic academic fields. In the 1950s, both schools increased PhDs by a factor of 6 over the 1930s, but they were still skewed towards applied fields. 30% at Rutgers were still in agriculture. At both, doctorates in the humanities and the social sciences were minuscule. Until well into the next decade, increasing the academic standing of the universities was merely one priority among many, and not a very high one on that list. Accommodating the rising tide of students was the uppermost necessity, and finding the resources that this required. In the 1960s, the National Science Foundation delayed a grant for science development funds to Rutgers until faculty salaries were raised closer to national norms so that they could recruit the personnel that they promised in their application. In 1966, the first rigorous rating of graduate programs appeared by Alan Carter, and it revealed an almost marginal status for both universities. Roughly half of the 1,600 departments surveyed were rated as distinguished, strong, or good. Out of 30 departments, both universities had 7 rated as good. Only microbiology was rated strong for Rutgers, chemistry and geology for Penn State. So what are we to make of such state of affairs? Let me conclude with 3 points. First, in the state of the academic research system in the 1960s, rising latecomers like Rutgers and Penn State found niches in semi-applied fields that were not reflected in peer ratings. Thus, Rutgers' strength in ceramics, Penn State's in acoustics and nuclear engineering did not register in the Carter ratings. Second, the Carter ratings changed the perceptions of prestige. If universities played down the ranking games, deans and department heads did not. The ratings gave them powerful incentives to seek to strengthen their faculties and graduate programs. Academic standing moved up several notches in institutional priorities, and more important, stimulated university investments in academic quality. Third, they had a good deal of company. An amalgamation of departmental ratings placed Rutgers and Penn State in a range of roughly from 30 to 40 in the academic standing. A report of a presidential commission in 1960 had called for a doubling of American research universities from the existing 15 or 20. Rutgers and Penn State were poised to join that group. And indeed, that is where you'll find them today, comfortably within the top 40 American research universities. So you might ask, what is new? In fact, the expansive and highly competitive American system, this is a tremendous accomplishment. While the top of the academic hierarchy never seems to change, that's not true for the middle ranks. Of the 13 universities ranked in 1964 in the same stratum with Rutgers and Penn State, 9 have fallen out of the top 40 in the last comprehensive rating. The average departmental score was strong for both Rutgers and Penn State. And research expenditures are nearly $700 million at Rutgers and over $800 million at Penn State. These are measures of enormous progress and achievement since 1965. All the more remarkable for having been accomplished, at least recently, with little state support. Becoming a contemporary research university, a world-class university, is a step-like process. Strenuous effort is required to attain standing on a high plateau, only to realize that the advancement of science and the competition from other institutions demand a renewed effort. That Rutgers and Penn State have repeatedly succeeded in renewing such efforts in the 1960s, again in the 1980s, and again since 2000 is testimony to the astute leadership of these universities, but also to an enduring spirit of excellence. Thank you.